Priyanka and team, you have both successfully completed, the MArch History and Theory of Architecture module. Team's exquisite chimeras 2020 Architecture and Theory dissertation and Priyanka's 2021 Zoological Enclosures were selected to represent our school at the RIBA President's Medals and are now part of the RIBA's online archive. What was it like, to be part of the learning framework of the history and theory?
Well, at times it felt uncomfortable and almost foreign, and it was, of course, very challenging too, but also exhilarating. I often felt like I was riding on the back of a wild horse. And there's a superb text from 1994 by Helen Sissou called 3 Steps on the Ladder of Writing. I was put onto this by you, Maria, during one of our precious dissertation discussion sessions, and it was the perfect way to get me to embrace my discomfort. Relinquish colonial control and see the feelings of foreignness as something useful. I devoured Sissou's book in a day, and there are 2 key quotes from it that were memorable, destabilizing moments of insight. I'd like to repeat one here for you, where Sissou writes about thinking the unthinkable. Where we hope we will not be afraid of understanding the incomprehensible, facing the invisible, hearing the inaudible, thinking the unthinkable, which is of course thinking. Thinking is trying to think the unthinkable. Thinking the thinkable is not worth the effort. It's a wonderful idea, and it reminds me of the true purpose and value of thinking. But I'm curious how you would approach thinking the unthinkable, Maria.
For me, thinking burns all bridges with the known. I'm attracted like a moth to the flames of Glissandi's trembling throat, to this almost instinctive urge that today forces us to reject almost all categories of fixed thought. Deep-seated bias and unquestioned beliefs and reassuring certainties on the conceptualization of nature, on gender categorization, on racial classification, are already melting away together with the architecture that sheltered and nourished them. Our buildings, our cities, our planetary configuration are all hosting ghosts that need at least to be acknowledged. The aggression towards the colonial and racist architecture past has already resulted in the 2020 report on histories of colonialism and historic slavery embedded into properties in the care of National Trust in the UK. COVID-19 revived gender stereotypes set in the design of family homes and disturbed the work-home infrastructure zoning principles in the planning of our cities. Climate change made architects aware that by extracting processes, moving around and accumulating matter, they don't just produce buildings, but continuously save the crust of the earth. So the problem today is not simply to decolonize the architecture curriculum by introducing more architecture examples from underrepresented regions or by architects who belong to our unrepresented groups because of their race and gender. This is not just a problem of numbers, how many buildings from the African continent or how many female architects should be added within a system of thought that establishes an architecture canon. Establishing the classification that makes the canon, and the concept of canon itself is the problem. I understand and practice the history and theory of architecture teaching as a setting of stage for the decolonization of the thinking of architecture. It is not just the selection of topics such as single mothers housing or crime, race, and architecture. It is rather how one destabilizes the standard thinking of any architectural topic. As with all thinking, the task is far from blissful. It involves a certain self-aggression, thinking against oneself. And your team accurately described the learning process of the module as riding a wild horse. And speaking of the wild, Priyanka, would you like to discuss the taming that the modernist zoological enclosures entailed and the architecture that could establish a different human-animal assemblage?
I think the key thing to understand is the exponential growth of research that comes to light regarding the design parameters related to animal enclosures in zoos over the past century. The enclosures heavily evolve around the closed showcasing exhibition spaces, from the modernist strategies to what they are today, and how we can envisage them as ever evolving. Whilst this is demonstrated in the history of zoo design, what opened a different path of thinking was the philosophical approach of Giorgio Agamben in his book, The Open, Man and Animal, and the distinction he makes between the Umwelt, which translates to the environment which is experienced by an organism, and the Umgebung, the environment of another's that is experienced upon observation. It becomes clear that whilst the environment may superficially or even physically seem identical, the experience within is profoundly unique to the individual. This begins to question the underlying presuppositions of designing for the non-human. For example, we've accepted Linnaeus classifications of animals set forth nearly 3 centuries ago. However, that is centered around one man's understanding of the perception of the world and a classification system that was set in place even before the Darwinian revolution. So the question can be answered, could be the following, that with 7 billion humans on the planet, with divergent perceptions and experiences of other species, and the changing conceptualization of nature, why do we still follow this age-old system of classification?
So Priyanka, I'll stay with you because you touched on the problem of taxonomy or ranked classification in the context of the 18th century scientific thinking. This was indeed an effort to record and create classes of entities and establish their hierarchical relationship. Minerals, plants, animals, humans, and later architecture styles and typologies were part of this endeavor. The classification of human races and the distinctive features of each race appeared in tables in which shapes and measurements of human skulls were indications of idiocy and nourished theories of racial inferiority or superiority. The classification approach of scientific thinking, although it doesn't attempt to map hierarchies, still produces a cut of things from their environment to be observed in isolation. However, current feminist theories of re-enchanting the word, such as, like the theories of Jane Bennett and Isabel Stenger, the female philosophers, propose instead the study of the complex and stable assemblages in which things and processes are implicated. The question you articulated about classification is very timely. Could you briefly describe your dissertation and tell us how your research challenged your thinking?
Well, challenge is an understatement. The research completely uprooted my personal beliefs, and I think that's what gave me the drive to dig deeper into understanding the topic. My research looked into the malfunctions of modernist enclosures of London Zoo. Whilst they fail as an environment for the occupant, for example, the animals, and how they have been addressed in the current enclosures that have replaced them. The modernist enclosures being Penguin Pool and Gorilla House by Berthold Bettgen that have been replaced over the last 20 years by current architects. However, looking at these, we can still discern an anthropocentric or human-centered approach. We can question whether these redesigns capture the problematic assumptions that cause the failures of the modernist enclosures, or whether they remain focused on the experience of the human observer. The dissertation questions more than it answers, which I think at this stage of my research is more important than trying to force an answer. My journey of research did not only take the form of an academic endeavor, but also made me aware of my own bias and my preconceptions. I started this module by choosing a completely different topic that didn't arouse a passion within me. This became quickly apparent in my waning performance because I was so detached from the topic. I didn't have the desire nor the interest to question and research. And after battling that for some time and with some good guidance from my supervisors and yourself, Maria, I decided to follow a topic I felt strongly about, regardless of its relationship with architecture. I looked at the architectural and design implications within my chosen topic after the fact. Up until this journey into zoological enclosures, I was completely anti-zoo. I saw them as traps and exhibition centres and not really much more. This module opened my eyes to the fact that there is more than just black and white, and the history and design of structures for the display of animals in zoos revealed aspects of the human-animal complex relationship. that I was not aware of this, and I can say that my opinion of the zoos have shifted 180 degrees. My research gave me knowledge on the historical and current operation of zoos and enticed me to continue to seek ways of designing animal enclosures that consider the current thinking of human-animal relationship. This is an ongoing project of which the dissertation was just the point of departure.
And thank you, Priyanka. And I would like to ask Tim now, since we are discussing animals. Tim, how did you ride your wild horse? Where did your exquisite chimeras take you? How did you turn your architectural experience into thinking experimentations with dreams and co-authorship?
Well, the allegorical wild horse for me took many chimeric forms, but the most important one to me was the adoption of a rather unorthodox research method suggested by you, Maria. I was drinking far too much coffee at the time and consequently having trouble sleeping. And when I did sleep, it was sort of tracing paper thin, and I dreamed about the things I'd been reading in the literature that orbits the topics I wanted to explore in my dissertation. This included things like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, other well-known texts by Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, the short, sharp thoughts of Donna Haraway and Marcus Steinweg, the longer, softer ruminations of Anna Singh and Deleuze. I was also reading otherworldly texts by Delphi Carstens and Timothy Morton, and was enthralled by the fascinating and fertile ground covered by Penelope Haralambadu on architectural allegory, and some of Anthony Vidler's ideas about the architectural uncanny too. Your suggestion, Maria, of keeping a dream journal filled with hastily scribbled sketches and texts from my sudden return to consciousness at the witching hour, 3 a.m., 4 a.m., allowed me to connect the dots of all the things I was learning about and play games with the thinking I had encountered, mixing it in sort of strange and intuitive ways that dream thinking allows. I started to embrace the Frankenstein's monsters I was creating, and the dissertation became a sort of post-mortem of this process, employing dream thinking, figurative theory, and fictional artifice as disruptive and immersive fiction as method. And this sort of set the tone for the analysis of 3 architectural case studies. These were described architecturally, using conventional reality mode descriptions, and then using personal memories or memory mode fictions describing visits to the buildings. Thinking geometries or ways of thinking derived from the literature were then used to critically analyze the case studies using the tools excavated from my research. The text also explored architectural authorship by examining architecture as a complex hyperentity and making kin with it, using an uncanny mix of psychological analysis, surrealist playfulness, and the intersubjectivity of dream thinking, allegory, hauntology, and hyperstition. These speculative, retrospective, and fantastical fictions were displayed as fusions of text and image, and became entangled with decolonialized thinking geometries and became morbidly fascinating. And the dissertation provided me with an enriched perspective on architectural authorship and new devices for thinking with architecture.
So, Tim, your remark on thinking with architecture relates also to the module's invitation to students to leave aside the reflective approach in favor of Karen Barad's feminist diffractive methodology. While reflective methods produce static representations of a reality that is assumed pre-existing and stayed, diffractive thinking attends to the fluidity of attachments enacted in specific configurations of assemblages. And there are, 2 images that there are in this presentation. And one is the male figure of the reflective conditions of perspectival geometry, to which we architects, we still use, this perspectival geometry, which is, male attitude towards, the world and the environment. And the second is, the trans-species, trans-body figure involved in diffractive assemblages that produce animated thing forms. But the images will show more on this differentiation between the 2 ways of thinking.
I remember talking to Priyanka about the imagery she intended to use to illustrate her dissertation. And I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about some of the decisions you made, Priyanka, perhaps reflecting on what Maria has just talked about and shown us.
Yes, well, the images I created to illustrate zoological designs were sort of set in two types: a set of observational sketches that I drew whilst on site, and a series of conceptual collages of assembled entities, i.e. the various actors, so humans and animals, the materiality of the architectural configuration, processes and intentions. What Maria has demonstrated is the distinction between the two. The observational sketch is a product of my reflective thinking, whilst the conceptual collage is an attempt to visualize the complexity and potential of assembled things, and thus my diffractive thinking. It's unclear how these conceptual designs could be transformed into architectural designs, but the aim of the dissertation is not to design. This task is reserved to the design studio module. The aim of this dissertation is to enable the thinking of conceptual designs.
Thank you, Priyanka, because that's very correct. Sometimes, there is a confusion that, dissertations should lead, to a design proposal, but actually, dissertations are opening of, thinking other alternatives.
Absolutely.
So the conceptual drawing is very important. So Tim, what were the buildings you selected as case studies? Because you described the process, but you didn't say what were the buildings. And how did you decolonize, the standard architecture representations by means of your chimeric drawings?
Okay, yeah, so there were sort of three case studies. All of them were modest chapels by well-known male architects. Peter Zumthor's 1988 Sumvik Chapel, Frank Lloyd Wright's Junior's 1951 Wayfarer's Chapel, and Le Corbusier's iconic 1955 Ronchamp Chapel. I chose religious buildings not because of any personal agenda or spiritual bias or belief, but to provide a sort of modicum of parity. But they're also all deeply personal encounters with architectural authorship that have left indelible impressions. They were all visited, accompanied by loved ones, and at salient times in my life. So as a result, aspects of my encounters with them still haunt me and my dreams and the creative acts that I undertake to this day. So what you'll see in some of the imagery describing the case studies examined in the text, they were first depicted using reality mode, conventional sort of objective architectural drawings, models and photography, then copy mode, showing some successful and unsuccessful copies of the original buildings. And it's here that the uncanny nature of the architectural copy is revealed and the adventure sort of really begins. I then used memory mode, photo montages composed of my photographs that I'd taken, layered to create versions of the case studies based on personal encounters with the monsters themselves. And then finally, I used dream mode, creating collages comprised of sketches excavated from my dream journal and other associative imagery uncovered whilst researching the topics, the language and methods in the literature. And it's in these images that the diffractive potential of the architectures is grafted. Decolonized representations are exhumed from the fossilized allegorical corpus of each exquisite chimera.
So I think there was so much material in what we have discussed so far, and I think it's best if we leave it to the discussion with our audience. So I would like here to provisionally close this discussion with the three of us by pointing out the French philosophers of non-philosophy, François Lariel's remark on the materiality of thinking. It is not only that thinking is a material process in the sense that it mobilizes our brain matter. So when I say think that, immediately, your neurons, your cells, in your brain, they start working. So it's a very material process. But what is even more important is that thinking can have material effects. So it means, when you think something and it's new and innovative, then something will materialize. But even if it's not innovative, whatever you think, you can materialize. So it has, thinking is it has this material aspect that we don't consider most of the time. So by decolonizing the thinking of architecture, a different architecture can manifest in the future. So thank you very much, both of you and the audience.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Priyanka.
Thanks.